Hello and welcome to Module 5. Today's module is all about positioning. For me, the pivotal challenge for most marketers. Pivotal in the sense not just that it's important, but pivotal in the sense that it begins to take us to the end of the strategy process, and it's very much, as we'll see in a couple of modules, the start and the driving force behind how we make tactical choices. So in today's session, we'll look at 5 key areas. First, we'll talk about what is positioning and where does the topic come from. It's a relatively new one in the marketing vocabulary, approximately 40 years old. Next, we'll look at the core model for working out your position, which is called the 3 C's. We'll then work on perceptual maps, which are the analytical technique we use in order to understand the battleground in which we'll develop our position. Then we'll move to a key topic, which is what's called the benefit ladder, and we'll look at how we use the benefit ladder to make sure our positioning is strong and persuasive. And finally, the all-important topic of articulation. The 3 C's will tell us what the positioning should be, but then how do you articulate it so your internal teams, your external agencies are able to understand and help execute the position successfully. Before we get into the topic of positioning though, let's locate it very clearly within the syllabus of the mini MBA. You'll remember that we talked extensively about the Holy Trinity of marketing, and the idea that there's really 3 core steps in developing a strong marketing strategy. The first one, of course, was segmentation, slicing the pie. The next one was then targeting and making a choice as to which segment or segments we were going to go after. And now positioning really completes the trinity, because for each of those target segments, we will now position our product or company or service to that target segment. The analogy we've been using throughout the mini MBA may again be helpful here. Think very much about segmentation here as creating a map of the market. The next stage then is to plan your journey, and that's something akin to what we do when we do targeting, planning where we are and crucially where we're not going to travel. And finally, that takes us to positioning, which is really about going on the journey. And again, it's a useful metaphor because it reminds you as a marketer to do it one step at a time. If you start going on the journey before you've finished your plan, it will go wrong. If you start deciding where you're going to go before you finish your map, it will go wrong. And so that discipline of doing it 1, 2, 3 and completing each step before you move to the next is very, very important. One other confusing thing about positioning is it has many different names. In business school, we're always going to call it positioning. But in the commercial world, it has evolved into innumerable different concepts and buzzwords, all of which literally mean the same thing. So you might not hear it called positioning in the meetings or with the agencies you work with. They may call it brand values, brand purpose, the value proposition, brand DNA, particularly if it's a luxury brand, core attributes, brand promise, brand personality, or brand essence. You'll meet many agencies and consultants who are going to tell you, oh no, this is different, and brand essence means something very different from brand personality. That's nonsense. As we'll see throughout this module, it's super important that you don't worry too much about the terminology. The point of positioning is it's what we want to stand for to our target market. Keep it that simple and it will help you to get the positioning right. In fact, I'm really keen for you to think about positioning very much from a customer-oriented point of view. You know, literally think about it as the brain cells of your customer. So here's our target customer. We identified her already. We know who she is, what she thinks, who the competition is, etc. Now the challenge is to jump one step forward and literally think about this customer walking around the street. We want to achieve 2 very simple but very difficult goals. First, we wanted to know that our brand or product or service exists. And then, and this is the positioning challenge, we want her to think certain things about our brand when she thinks about our brand, whatever those may be. The point is, That's positioning. Positioning refers to the mental position of our product or service in the mind of the target customer. Always remember that, and you'll stay in relatively good shape. The concept of positioning was invented by these two advertising men that you see before you, Al Rizson and Jack Trout. The two men were famous because in the early 70s they published 3 seminal articles in Advertising Age in which they challenged the dominance at that point of creativity as the point of advertising and suggested instead that the ultimate goal of communication and in fact marketing was positioning, was getting the brand positioned in the mind of the customer. This caused in the mid-70s a giant debate in the American advertising industry, which ultimately Rizson and Trout won and led to their famous book, Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind. And it was here that they define for the first time, and it's still a very good definition, what this concept of positioning actually means. Positioning is not what you do to the product, it's what you do to the mind of the prospect. It's how you differentiate your brand in the mind. Positioning compensates for our over-communicated society by using an oversimplified message to cut through the clutter and get into the mind. Positioning focuses on the perceptions of the prospect, not on the reality of the brand. The key to getting positioning right in practice is to use a very simple, deceptively simple model called the 3 C's. Now there are many C's in the world of MBAs, but this is a very special model devoted to working out what your positioning should be, and it's actually foolproof if you follow the instructions correctly. So, as the name suggests, there are 3 C's. Let's start with the first C that we always start with, which is the customer C. We have to make sure we position on what the customer wants. Let's move to our next C, which is the competition C. We're not just positioning to a target customer, we're also positioning against competitors and trying to be either different or better than them. And finally, don't forget the last C, which is the company C, which is this something we can deliver? Can the company, both in real terms and perceptual terms, deliver this position successfully to our customer versus the competitive set? So that's the 3 C's model. Let's look at 3 different case studies now that illustrate how the 3 C's works. Let's start with a very famous case from America. Quidel is an astonishing company. It's a diagnostic company that can analyze human liquids like blood or urine or semen and tell many different things about you from that analysis. Many years ago, their very advanced technological skills allowed them to develop a pregnancy test, a test that at the time was far more reliable and much faster to give you a result than anything out there in the marketplace. And they hired a consulting firm to advise them on how they could sell this product over the counter as a home pregnancy test. It's a very famous case study because of what happened next. So the consulting firm did everything we've talked about in modules 1 and 2. They were market oriented, they did lots of qualitative and quantitative research, and in the end they discovered there were 2 segments for the pregnancy test. The first segment were the hopefuls. These were women that wanted to get pregnant. They were typically aged 18 to 45 years old, very broad spread of income, and obviously hoping, as the name suggests, for a positive result. And then there were the fearfuls, also age range 18 to 45, also widespread of income, demographically identical to the hopefuls, but attitudinally and behaviorally completely the opposite, because as the name suggests, they were very fearful they were pregnant and were hoping for a negative result. To make the situation even more complex, the 2 segments were almost exactly the same size. And so the question for Quidel was, which segment should we go after? In this case, because they were so huge and they had a product that spoke to both different segments, Quidel decided to target both, but crucially now with very different positioning statements. So, to the hopefuls, they positioned this very successful pregnancy test as certainty that your family will grow or begin. Meanwhile, targeting the fearfuls, they positioned it as the relief of all your fear and worry. So what essentially they were able to do was to take the same product, which was identical to begin with, but work on the basis that if each segment wants something different, we must therefore position differently to each one. It's not what we're selling, that would be product oriented, it's what the customer is buying. And if they're buying something different, we should position differently too. So the hopefuls, based on this positioning, ended up with a brand called Conceive. The name itself, the packaging, big box, big picture of a baby, all very much linked to this positioning statement. And when it was retailed, it was actually retailed right next to the other home pregnancy tests, as you might expect. A few years down the line, Quidel realized that if the positioning of the Conceive brand was certainty a family will grow or begin, then pregnancy tests weren't the only product they should offer. And they actually developed a home ovulation test as well to help deliver that position and make them even more money. Meanwhile, over in the fearful sector, that positioning of removing fear and worry led to a very different packaging execution. Small box, medicinal looking, no picture of no baby. More importantly still, they discovered that many of the fearfuls, when they went to buy their home pregnancy test, went into the part of the drugstore where condoms were being sold. Now that doesn't make any sense, it's too late for that, but nonetheless, Quidel were the only pregnancy test in that part of the store because they knew that's where the segment went. And again, QuickView wasn't just a pregnancy test. In fact, Quidel had used that brand already on several other home diagnostic products. These were tests to see if you had strep, chlamydia, or other ailments. So what you see here is a remarkable story of positioning, because remember, to begin with, that's the same chemical solution going into both products. But the point is, who cares? If the customer is buying something different, we must position differently, and then the positioning drives everything else. So that's the customer C. The first place we look, the very first place we look, is the customer needs. Now, I used to do the 3 C's in a very different way, and I would tell clients that they should look at all 3 C's simultaneously. In recent years, I realized that's incorrect. Start here, literally. Look at that customer and look at what turns them on, and begin with that driving your search for positioning. And remember, you're in a good place here because, cast your mind back to the previous module, we built these amazing portraits of our target customer. Look at those portraits. They're going to tell you what's important to this customer. Start there. The other good thing about those portraits is they don't just tell you about the customer, they're also going to tell you who the competition is as well. Because remember, inside a good portrait of a particular segment is also which brands they are currently using or would consider using versus your brand, and all of that has come from research. This is an invaluable source of information. The reason it's so invaluable is because defining competition is often the place where companies go wrong. To be frank, I don't think you necessarily know who your competitors are. So before you start getting all competitive here, pause and ask yourself the question, who is my competitor? Typically, when companies do that, they get it wrong. So let's do it from Marketing Week point of view. Who is Marketing Week's competitor? Well, if we were very myopic, we would say Campaign. They published Marketing Magazine. Historically, they've been our competitor since we launched Marketing Week some 40 years ago. So they must be our competition, right? So often you'll find companies myopically think that companies that have traditionally competed with them or look like them or do things in a similar way, that's how they define the competition. That's very myopic because we're missing the bigger picture. Now, the other extreme here is we can actually go for what's called substitutability. In these instances, we challenge ourselves, say, well, what else could be a competitor for our brand? And maybe we say, well, marketers spend a lot of time on their PlayStations, therefore PlayStation is competing with Marketing Week for a marketer's attention. I think that's nonsense. I think it's going too far. How on earth are we going to compete with a Sony PlayStation? So I think substitutability goes too far. The right answer is to be, of course, market oriented. A good marketer asks the customers to tell you who is the competition. In your research, you ask them which other brands would you consider, and that consideration set, that list of other brands, which will often surprise you, that forms the competitive set. In the case of marketing, we know from our research that Mashable.com is a significant competitor for our readers. Now, that's a surprise because they don't have a print magazine, they're in a different sector, but that's what the data tells us. And remember what we learned in the previous module about segments as well. Different segments will usually have different brands and therefore different competitors to aim at. So it's not just that Mashable is a competitor for us, it's a competitor in one segment. It could well be in a different segment we're going after. It's the creative review. So the challenge for you is to make sure you define the competitive set correctly by first identifying the customer and then asking them which brands they would consider. So this is the second C, the C of competition. Let me tell you a story to illustrate how competitive forces work to hopefully give you the best positioning statement possible. Many years ago, the famous soft cheese brand Dairylea embarked upon a product innovation. So you know Dairylea as well as me. Most British kids grew up with it. It's served, as you know, in cheese triangles, and typically it's what mothers and fathers give to their kids because it's full of calcium, etc. Well, many years ago, Dairylea came up with a rather successful product innovation. Rather than selling the cheese in triangles, they came up with this delightful product called Dairylea Dunkers. And the idea was you'd get this carton, which you'd open up, and inside there were dried breadsticks and some Dairylea soft cheese. The target market for this segment was the under 15 lunchbox school child. So this is a kid that's going to school each day and doesn't take money for a school dinner. Instead, they get a packed lunch from their parents. And the idea was that somehow the Dairylea Dunker would become part of that kid's everyday lunchbox. Well, like any good company, Kraft, the makers of Dairylea, and their agency at the time, J. Walter Thompson, did a lot of focus groups to try and understand more about school lunchboxes. It sounds a strange thing, but the focus groups were split between kids and parents to try and understand how they felt and thought and behaved with respect to lunchboxes. And interestingly, the focus group revealed one big insight. And the insight was, if you think about your typical school lunch, either one that you're now packing if you're in your 30s or 40s, or the one that you had packed for you 25 years ago as a kid, there are three things that go into a packed lunch. First, the sandwich. Second, the drink. And third, a third thing. Now that instantly struck the team at Kraft and J. Walter Thompson as a big insight. Could they make the Dairylea Dunker the third thing to go into the lunchbox? And more interestingly, they investigated in the focus groups all the different third things and how they were perceived both by the parents and by the kids. And here we quickly discover that children and parents, of course, see the world very differently. So for the parents, there was only one criterion, and the criterion was, no surprise, nutrition. Meanwhile, the kids in the other focus group, when they were talking about what was important to them in a packed lunch, and specifically a third thing, were not talking about nutrition, they were talking about fun. And so you have this classic 2x2 grid, and now we're able to look at the different third things and where they might sit in this grid. I'm sure you already know the answers. If we take the top right grid, the parents think it's nutritional, but the kids don't think it's fun, it's very boring. The third thing that typically sits in that sector is fruit. If we take the bottom right corner and we look at things that the kids think are boring and the parents think are not very nutritional, we get to chips and potato crisps. If we come a little bit closer and we go down to this bottom left-hand segment where we're looking for things that kids think are fun but the parents think are not very nutritional, we get to third things that come from chocolate, sweets and candy. And finally, the interesting question is, what do you think appears here? The kids think it's fun and the parents think it's nutritional. Can you guess? The answer is, well, the answer is nothing. This is what marketers call the niche. It's kind of like finding, I don't know, the Ark of the Covenant or something. This is the magical place. It's a hole in the market, a place of great opportunity, and in modern marketing circles, something that we very rarely discover. It was clear to the team at J. Walter Thompson that to successfully launch Dairylea Dunkers, they had to position the product as being two things: nutritional to the parents and obviously fun to the kids. Now it gets even better though. All the parents grew up on Dairy Lee. There's a residual brand equity for Dairy Lee and its calcium content. They already thought hands down it was one of the most nutritional products around. So in this case, the actual positioning didn't have to include nutritional because it already had it in spades. The challenge for Dairy Lee Dunkers was to communicate that it was fun, and specifically fun to the kids. And that's where a very clear brief to the creative team at J. Walter Thompson produced the following advertising campaign.
Dairy Lee inside Dairy Lee Dunkers is so delicious and creamy, you'll want to dunk almost anything into it. However, we recommend you dunk the breadsticks provided. The Dairy Lee you can dunk.
So, you probably don't recognize this beautiful vehicle behind me because it's a Holden. Holden is one of the leading automotive brands in Australia, and it's been around a long time. In fact, it has as many vehicles that look like this still driving around as it does the newer versions. Holden began life more than a century ago as a wagon maker, and then was acquired by General Motors and essentially became their equivalent of Vauxhall down in Australia. It's a very much loved brand, and it's been part of the fabric of Australian culture for a very long time. So imagine the shock when the newspapers revealed about 2 years ago that Holden was about to cease all manufacturing in Australia. The news spread like wildfire, and very quickly social media, television channels, everyone was talking about the fact that Australia's oldest automotive brand was about to stop manufacturing in Australia itself. In response, the only thing the Holden marketing team could do was launch this now infamous 60-second TV commercial.
We're here.
And we're here.
We're here.
Here.
And here.
And here.
We're here.
We're here.
Here.
We're here.
And here.
Here.
We're here. Here.
And we're here.
Holden has been here for over 100 years, and while in the future we'll no longer make cars in Australia, we'll always be committed to making the best cars for Australia. That's something that'll never change.
Because we're here to stay.
The response to that advertising campaign was sensationally bad. In fact, for many critics, it became the most hated ad in the history of Australian advertising. Indeed, many customers took to social media to vent their own personal anger at the campaign. Aaron Kearney, for example, said, "We're here to stay is your new positioning statement. That is patently absurd and just a bit like twisting the knife." Darren Hinch said, "I've commented before, but the Holden We're Here ads are the most insulting, paternalistic pieces of crap I've seen in years." And Simon Thompson said, "Holden We're Here to Stay ad is like renewing your marriage vows while shacking up with your mistress." So it's an interesting question. 7 or 8 days after announcing they were going to stop manufacturing in Australia, why run a campaign saying we're here? Well, it's kind of interesting because obviously it's something the customer wanted to hear. If I love Holden, if I own Holden, if I want to buy a Holden in the future, I want to hear that you're still going to be sticking around. Similarly, if you look at Holden's competitors, mostly the large Japanese automakers like Toyota, for example, the idea of being Australian and still part of Australia is a big competitive advantage. The problem, of course, is Holden can no longer make that statement. They don't have the company C in place. They're no longer going to be manufacturing cars in Australia. And this is a very interesting example, and not an unusual one, of where a company is making a promise that customers want, that differentiates them versus competitors, but which they simply cannot deliver upon. So don't forget this last competitor C. It's crucial. What it tells you is branding and positioning is certainly a promise, but before you make the promise, you must be able to check that you will deliver 100% of the time on whatever it is you're going to position upon. This is sometimes called aspirational positioning, in which the advertising agency suggests that we can claim this position and then we'll deliver afterwards. Don't fall into that trap. The only strong positioning, as we learned from the Holden case, is one where you can definitely make the promise before you make the promise. So there we have it, the 3 C's. It's a deceptively simple framework, but it works pretty much every time if you can tick all 3 boxes. Think about it. If you can find a position which is what our target customer wants, which is what we can deliver better than or different than the competition, and you can communicate and deliver that to customers, you are going to make money. But the trick comes when you've done your 3 C's analysis and unfortunately for whatever reason you simply can't find a position that ticks all 3 boxes. What do you do in situations like that? Well, I like to think about the 3 C's and the whole principles of segmentation, targeting and positioning kind of like a railway track. And it's like a railway track because although you have to do the steps in sequence, you can also reverse back as well. Let me explain. Let's go through the process quickly. As we've already said, you start by doing your segmentation. That, of course, then leads to targeting, and you choose a very attractive, very large, very lucrative target segment. And as we've learned in this module, then you do the positioning to the target segment. But let's say you find the positioning is not possible. No matter how hard you try, exhaustive efforts, you're unable to pass the 3 C's test. You can't find a positioning that works. In those situations, it would be commercial suicide to keep going with something that isn't strategically correct. So pause and now reverse. Come back to targeting. Find another target segment, almost as attractive perhaps as the one you tried to go after in the first instance, and still very commercially attractive. Go after that segment and then, of course, try to position to that one. The key point here is don't rush into execution and tactics. Get your strategy right. In many situations I've been involved in, there's a beautifully attractive target segment, but we simply don't have a play. As a good marketer, have the confidence and the courage and the wisdom to reject that segment because you don't have a positioning play and choose another segment where you'll make far more money by going after that one instead. Of course, we don't actually use the 3 C's triangle when we do positioning in practice. This is very much how we talk about it in business school. In reality, the 3 C's is usually expressed in what we call a perceptual map. Let's take a look at a typical example. So here, for example, imagine for a moment that you're the brand manager for Porsche. What a lovely thought. And what you want to do is understand the 3 C's. So you go out and do some research in which you interview your target customers about their perceptions of both your brand and the competitor brands too. And you express the results like this. As you can see, it's a 2x2 grid, measuring all the different brands on 2 main attributes. The first one, how practical versus classy is the brand. And the second attribute, how conservative versus sporty is the brand. You gather all the research and you allocate the brands on the axis like this. And now we have the 3 C's in an analytical framework. So first of all, we have our customer C through the perceptions on the 2 axes. Next, we have obviously the position of our own brand Porsche, the company C, and how it's perceived and where it sits. And finally, we have all of our competitor brands and their respective positions versus us. So this is what the 3 C's actually looks like in most marketing plans. Even the great Steve Jobs used perceptual maps. Here he is, for example, back in 2007, using a perceptual map as an integral part of his iPhone launch strategy.
Let me talk about a category of things. The most advanced phones are called smartphones, so they say. And they typically combine a phone plus some email capability, plus they say it's the internet, sort of the baby internet. into one device, and they all have these plastic little keyboards on them. And the problem is that they're not so smart and they're not so easy to use. So if you kind of make a Business School 101 graph with a smart axis and the easy to use axis, phones, regular cell phones are kind of right there. They're not so smart and they're not so easy to use. But smartphones are definitely a little smarter, but they actually are harder to use. They're really complicated. Just for the basic stuff, people have a hard time figuring out how to use them. Well, we don't want to do either one of these things. What we want to do is make a leapfrog product that is way smarter than any mobile device has ever been and super easy to use. This is what iPhone is. Okay?
Like the Porsche example, Steve Jobs' perceptual map is a paragon of simplicity because it uses only two attributes, smart and easy, to position both the competitors and Apple's own product in the market. We call this approach two-dimensional perceptual mapping. And I've added an Excel spreadsheet from the wonderful marketing professor Jeff Fripp to allow you to play around with building two-dimensional maps of your own marketplaces. While it's good to keep things simple, the main limitation of two-dimensional perceptual maps is that they actually oversimplify the market. In reality, most customers consider more than two attributes when they make many of their purchase decisions. So what we really need is the ability to look at 7, 8, or 10 different attributes simultaneously for both our brand and the competitors. And that means we have to move from a two-dimensional perceptual map to what's called a multi-attribute perceptual map that looks something like this. Now, don't panic. The first thing that throws a lot of marketers is, oh my goodness, where's the axis gone? Well, in a multi-dimensional perceptual map, there usually isn't an axis. Instead, we're going to use a statistical analysis of the different brands and attributes, and we're going to present them, as you can see here, kind of almost in a three-dimensional space. The way to read a chart like this is the closer 2 points are together, the more similar they're perceived by the market. Now, this particular example comes from Tourism Victoria, which is an Australian tourism department that surrounds Melbourne. And it was done many years ago to try and work out how would they market the city of Melbourne to domestic Australian tourists. Now, what you see here is a map of Australia, but not a geographic map, a perceptual map. And you note here straight away there are some clear insights. You'll note, for example, and perhaps this comes as no surprise, down in that bottom segment, you'll see that cozy, boring, and compact are all relatively close together. As one might expect, they're perceived to be quite similar. In contrast, you'll notice that sophisticated and relaxed are almost at the two further reaches of the map. Again, that makes sense because perceptually, if you're sophisticated, you may not be relaxed, and vice versa. So you begin to get a sense how to interpret this map. The closer together, the more similar they are perceptually. The further apart, the more different they are. Now, the real value of this map, of course, is looking at how the different brands, or in this case, the different cities, are perceived. And you see here straight away that the city of Melbourne and its marketers in charge of tourism have some clear insights. Don't forget, first of all, that the ones that are furthest away from you are clearly things that you are perceived to be weak on. In the case of Melbourne, it isn't a warm place, and it's also not an adventurous place, at least in the perceptions of the market. The good news is those attributes closer to home, festive, stylish, sophisticated, cultural, this is the meat of what Melbourne has to work with. And so this shows you very clearly how we can use a perceptual map to identify what we own versus the competitors. Of course, the other challenge is working out which of these attributes are more or less attractive to the target market. One final point to remember, and one reason I like this perceptual map very much, you'll notice that there are negative as well as positive attributes contained in the map. That's super useful, and make sure that when you're measuring your attributes, as many of the attributes are negative as well as positive, you want to be able to see both. So, how do you build a multi-dimensional perceptual map like the one I've just shown you? It's actually not that complex, and I've again offered you an Excel spreadsheet as part of this week's readings that allows you to play around with that in your own time. So, having completed the 3 C's analysis, there's one last little step here which we have to complete. You may know you want to position on certain things, but at what level do you want to position upon them? And to understand what level, you have to understand what we call the benefit ladder. So let me illustrate the benefit ladder with a simple case using a particular product. So I'm going to sell you on a product. In this case, of course, I'm going to sell you on Marketing Week. That's the product itself. So how do I want to position the Marketing Week product? Let's go up the ladder one step at a time, and let's go to the first rung of the ladder, which is the most accessible one, which is just simple product features. Come with me. So we get with product features weekly in-depth coverage, specialist attention to marketing, and these 18 full-time journalists that are all dedicated to covering marketing topics. They're all wonderful things, but they're things about the product, the features of the product itself of Marketing Week. Let's go to a higher level and talk about the product benefits that we accrue because of those features. The benefits of having those things below us is now we get specialist coverage, we provide in-depth knowledge, and we're always on top of all the main marketing issues. So these are good product benefits, but we can still go much higher. Rather than talking about the benefits of what Marketing Week offers, let's jump to the customer at the next level and talk about what the benefits are to the customer. If you read Marketing Week, you know what's going on, you know what the big issues are, and perhaps most importantly, it's going to make you a better marketer because you are more aware of the big topics. So now we're getting to something much more valuable and much more rewarding, even though we're still essentially working off the same fundamental strengths. Now we're talking about customer benefits, but we can go even higher, one step higher, to what we call emotional benefits. What are the emotional benefits of all of this? Well, as a marketer, you start to feel more confident because you know what's going on. You feel, frankly, a cut above. And overall, you're a better marketer for all of this, and you feel like it too. That's an emotional feeling that our product can hopefully speak to for its target customer. Now, all of these advantages, all the way down, are coming from the same places, but it's at the level that I choose to play them where a lot of the skill of positioning lies. You can't always get to the top of the ladder, not every time, not everything is emotional, but the higher up the ladder you can climb, the more attractive and powerful the positioning is going to turn out to be. That's all very good in theory. Now let's look at an actual example where the benefit ladder was fundamental in transforming the fortunes of one of America's biggest brands, Walmart. As Walmart's logo back then clearly demonstrates, there wasn't too much complexity in how the giant retailer was positioning itself. Always low prices, always. This was clearly an example of positioning on a product feature, a single feature, which is we have the lowest prices around. Walmart also had an extensive TV campaign which featured the Rollback Man, in which again, very simply, prices were shown going backwards thanks to Walmart's low price guarantee. The problem with this approach to positioning purely on a single product feature of low price was it began to stop working. Around about 2005, Walmart's then CEO had to admit they were missing their sales targets for a simple reason. Consumers would no longer want to come to Walmart for high-end goods, and high net worth consumers wouldn't be seen dead inside the supermarkets. It therefore became apparent that Walmart would have to try and reposition itself, and it did so in a disastrous campaign which saw Walmart trying to sell $500 bottles of French wine, and even more infamously, advertising its fashions in US Vogue. When that didn't work, the Walmart executive team created a new position, Chief Marketing Officer, and hired Stephen Quing, an established marketer from Frito-Lay, to take the position. Quinn spent several months analysing the situation and then came back with a very clear diagnosis. He told the board, people know they can save money by shopping at Walmart. The emotional connection was what the savings allowed the family to do. Quinn's point could not be more simple. You cannot reposition Walmart, but what you can do is take that single product feature of low prices and climb the benefit ladder to something more meaningful and attractive to your target segments. And that's what Quinn set out to do. He asked the question, well, what is ultimately the benefit of a low price? And the answer was, of course, saving money. So he commissioned research to show that the average family would save $2,500 a year if they shopped exclusively at Walmart. And then he went further. He said, well, what's the overall customer benefit of saving money? Well, it's living better. And armed with that insight, he changed the logo and the strapline for the retailer. Walmart, save money, live better. And finally, he asked an even bigger question. What's the emotional benefit of saving money and living better for the American families that Walmart targets? And he came back with a single insight. It's feeling good about your family and the way things are going. And with that emotional insight, Quinn commissioned a very different kind of advertising campaign to promote Walmart going forward. Quinn was fantastically successful, not because he repositioned Walmart, but because he went up the benefit ladder off the same attribute, but looked at where the value was. And like all good marketers, having done his analysis, he had to do the final step in positioning, which is what we call articulation. In Quinn's case, he decided the best way to articulate this position that he wanted to adopt in the market was to use what he called a company purpose. And as you can see, the company purpose was very simple: saving people money so they can live better. Now, this is only one of very many different examples of how you can position a brand. There are many different words, as we said at the start of the module. You don't have to use a purpose. For example, you can use, in this case, a value proposition. This is Maersk, the large B2B company, which has a very wordy but very technical value proposition of what they offer. You don't have to go that way. You can go with core values. For many decades, Volvo have had 3 core values, which is how they position their cars: safety, quality, and respect for the environment. If you don't like that approach, you can do what Sephora does, which has brand DNA. According to their website, they have 3 genes in their DNA, as you can see here. If you don't like that, let's try some brand values. This is what KPMG uses. You don't like that? How about a brand essence? If you don't like that, let's go back to a brand purpose. Look at Johnny Walker. The key point here is it doesn't matter. Choose whatever approach that best fits your organization and will best convey the spirit of the brand to everyone within and outside of the organization itself. Remember what we said at the start of this module. All these words mean the same thing. Someone will turn up and tell you, oh, that's different from that. They don't know what they're talking about. Fundamentally, choose the right kind of approach that fits what you're trying to do. But the one thing I would tell you to be very careful about is to make sure, whether you call it brand attributes or brand DNA or value proposition, keep it tight. Let me explain with that game we used to play when we were children called Chinese whispers. In China, alas, they don't call it Chinese whispers, they call it goose goose in Mandarin. In France, they call it la téléphone arabe. It's that game where, if you remember, we stand on the playground and one child whispers a word into the ear of the next child, who whispers it into the ear of the next child, and it goes down the line until the person right at the end shouts out what they think they've heard. Now, if I choose something super complex, I don't know, I could whisper, in fact, the perceived belligerency of the China-Russian nexus is driven by a shared historical and ideological connection which is manifested in both states, adopting an authoritarian neo-Marxian style government. It will pass through the line, deeply complicated, until the person way down the bottom says, eh? In contrast, if I choose something simple and whisper, I don't know, banana, it will stay banana all the way down the line until my friend right at the end there says, banana. It's a strange example to use, but it's a perfect one to illustrate why tightness in positioning is so important. Imagine this line of people isn't kids in a playground. Imagine it's your organization and you're the head of marketing. And you've got to go through many different levels of people. Your own staff, retailers, service people, agencies, customers, consumers. And the only person that really matters is right at the end of the chain, is the consumer you're going after. If you create a super complex positioning statement with 28 words and concentric circles, you feel great because you've made something very complex and detailed. But the minute you try and send that down the line so it can actually work on customers, it will disappear and turn into nothing. The key lesson here is to keep it as tight as possible. Any moron can find 25 words to position their brand on. Only the best marketers can use 2 or 3 to convey the message tightly with total impact. So, the key lessons on positioning, in my experience, is that doing this for very large brands for a relatively long period of time, really come down to a couple of key challenges. The first one is, I don't care what you call your new positioning, but don't use multiple terminologies. I see this kind of stuff all the time. Companies that have attributes and benefits and core values and personality, there is too much here. Choose. I don't care whether it's a brand purpose or a brand DNA, but choose one construct. The second challenge, don't use too many attributes. Again, I see this kind of nonsense all the time. This is a madness. We have 35 different attributes here, and it will all disappear before you know it. Be tight. Be focused. Think of positioning as a magic bullet. Maybe 1 or 2 bullets, but that's all, has a chance to hit the target. Come back to what we said at the start. Less is more. Less words, less concepts has a chance of actually getting into the head of your target customer. And again, ultimately remember what positioning is. Positioning is not an end in itself. Designing some beautiful presentation or brand book or lovely diagram with circles and keyholes is not the point of positioning. Positioning is a means to an end, and the end is getting 2 or 3 words or associations into the head of the target customer. If you remember that and you stay focused upon it, your positioning has a chance to get through and ultimately to be successful. All you have to do to get this right is, first of all, pass the 3 C's test. And second, articulate your positioning in a tight and extremely economic way. My acid test for any marketer is, if I press the B button and your positioning statement disappears, can you still remember what it is? Too many times, unfortunately, that's not the case. So that's it. Module 5, positioning, 5 key take-homes. The first one, obviously, the importance of the 3 C's approach. Challenge yourself to make sure that your positioning ticks all 3 boxes. It has to be what my customer wants, I have to be able to deliver it, and I have to be able to deliver it better or different from the competition. Second, the benefit ladder. It's a supremely useful tool. You can't always get to the very top and find the emotional benefit of selling industrial welding equipment or office stationery. But the further up that ladder you can go, as we see in the Walmart case, the more successful your positioning will be. 3, the importance of articulation. Once you've found the right position, take time and care in how you express and explicitly articulate the position so everyone can get it. Item 4, Don't use too many positioning concepts. I don't care whether you call it brand DNA, brand attributes, brand flavors, magic moonbeams. It doesn't matter. Choose the right approach for your organization and your culture. But don't use more than one approach, because as you add levels and layers to the definition of the brand, the chance of it working dissipates rapidly. And finally, once you've chosen whatever concept you wish to use to describe the brand, don't use too many attributes to define it. Keep it tight. You know, if I could share with you all of the international brands I've been lucky enough to work for over the last 20 years and their positioning statements, which is obviously confidential, you'd see there's a very close correlation between less words to describe the brand and a lot of success coming later from the executions. Less is certainly more here. So that completes Module 5, Positioning. As usual, you've got a copy of the module notes, and our assigned reading this week comes from Darden, one of the finest, oldest American business schools. It's called Positioning, the Essence of Marketing. Again, it's not the most up-to-date or the most exciting reading, but it's what is usually said during the positioning class at most of the top MBA programs that I've been involved in. Now some optional readings. Again, I've set you one of my FE video cases, this week looking at the incredible story of Apple and how it positioned itself for success. There's an awful lot of bullshit being said and written about Apple. One of the great things about this FE video case, other than it's very short, is that it's based on the actual submissions from the Apple company when they submitted for FE prizes. So it actually comes from the company itself. A masterclass in how to position a brand. Then there's a trio of my own columns. The first one looks at British cafe chain Pret a Manger and their challenges related to positioning back in 2019. The next column looks at the idea of not just positioning to a consumer, but also a very valid approach, sometimes positioning against a competitor in order to strengthen that position to the target market. And finally, there's a critical review of the concept of brand purpose. And finally, 2 extra free gifts for you this week. We spoke a little bit in this module about the importance of perceptual mapping. There's a fantastic professor based down in Sydney called Jeff Fripp. Fripp's a world expert in building perceptual maps. And on his website, you can access all kinds of different, easy to build perceptual maps. And I've actually gone ahead and licensed his most advanced perceptual map, a multi-dimensional scale, similar to the one that we looked at for tourism, that you can use and complete and fill out for your own brands using Jeff's foolproof approach. So, there's all the readings and materials. That's positioning. I'll see you for Module 6 and the core concept of marketing strategy.
I think I think there's only two options, and maybe there's another one, but so you know John, right? Yeah. So usually he gonna check with the supplier. Yeah. Then they